if you want to enhance your longevity, and especially if you want to enhance your health span. I'm more interested in health span than lifespan. Walking will get you a reasonable amount, but in order to really improve your health span, you need moderate to vigorous physical activity, MVPA, and that's what the recommendations are.
Welcome to the Proof Podcast, a space for science-based conversation exploring the health and longevity benefits that come with mastering nutrition, physical exercise, mindfulness, recovery, sleep, and alignment. Facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations, minus the hyperbole. Howdy friends, great to be here with you. I'm Simon Hill, and you're listening to The Proof. A little bit about me. I'm a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist with an undergraduate science degree and a master's in the science of human nutrition. My passion is talking science and helping make sense of it for everyday folks wanting to live a healthier, more fulfilling life. Today I sit down with exercise physiologist, nutritionist, and neuroscientist Paul Taylor to continue delving into all things exercise, a new theme that we've been exploring together on this show over the last month or so. This episode builds on previous episodes with one major goal: to consolidate our learning so far and leave you with solid, practical information that you can use to better your own personal exercise regime, improve your health, lower your risk of chronic disease, and set yourself up to live longer. Please do enjoy. This is my conversation with Paul Taylor. Alrighty, so take two, Paul Taylor. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on this miserable day. It's making an Irishman feel very at home.
Yes, we spoke earlier. We're in the middle of the third La Nina year in a row here in Sydney. So it's been tough. It's been different. Sydney's used to very, very predictable weather, sunny conditions. So reminding me of growing up in Melbourne.
Yes, and I can't help. I was doing a breakfast talk this morning, and I did have to rather smugly comment on the fact that every time I come to Sydney now, it's raining. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Melbourne, we actually had the best summer that I have experienced in 17 years last year.
Yes. So I heard from my brother. Constantly reminding me that. Yes. Anyway, thanks for doing this.
Pleasure.
We had a Zoom call about a month ago now. I was in Bali and we connected, and it was a great conversation. I was really amazed with all of the information that you have to share about exercise and topic that we've been exploring on the show over the last month or so. I'm not sure if you caught any of those episodes, but I thought with your background, exercise physiology, nutrition, neuroscience, you could really help us further explore this and help make many of the kind of learnings that we've touched on so far really accessible for people and practical. So I kind of wanted the focus of this episode to be for the general person. So not necessarily the superstar athlete. I mean, anyone can really benefit from this information, but that avatar that I'm thinking about is someone who's perhaps early 40s or in their 50s, and they're really looking at their lifestyle and their behaviors. And when it comes to exercise, they're looking at it and thinking, what can I fit into a week, firstly? And then from there, how should I structure it so that I am lowering my risk of chronic disease and hopefully being able to live a longer life? So I thought that could be sort of the focus of today's episode. So tell me how you kind of have landed in this space where you are now. So I just mentioned your sort of academic background. You've done a lot, and on top of that, professional boxing. Where did all of this come from in terms of your own career path and sort of passion for all things health and wellness, and particularly a kind of focus on exercise?
Yeah, so look, it started at university. I did my master's degree in exercise science, and then I went a bit sideways and I joined the military. So I spent 8 years in the British military, flying in helicopters, doing anti-submarine warfare, helicopter search and rescue. Went through combat survival and resistance to interrogation training and all of that fun stuff.
Resistance to interrogation
training.
Wow,
yes.
that would have been interesting.
That was 10 days of pretty hardcore stuff that they don't do anymore because of health and safety.
What kind of things were they putting you through?
So basically we rocked up. You're told to bring one set of all of your basically winter flying gear. And they gave us a brief and then said, right, well, tomorrow morning we're getting up at 6 a.m. So make sure you get a good night's sleep. Then it's about 11:30. And then we went to bed and got woken up about midnight, rather rudely woken up, and then dragged out, taken out to this place and introduced to Fred, who's a 16-stone dummy. I don't know, what's 120 kilos, something like that. And they told us,
Big boy.
And they said, Fred is injured. You guys have got to get him out of here. Got to get him to a Kazovac place where he's going to be evacuated. But, typical war scenario. This is a really hot place. You can't take him here. You're going to have to carry him. And we had to carry him for about 10 kilometers and had to do a river or a crossing through a lake and it was winter in the UK. And the way you get across a lake in winter is you get into the Buffy Boo and you put all your clothes in. All they gave us was a Gore-Tex bivy bag. So it's like a covering for a sleeping bag that's waterproof, but there's no heat in it. So you put all your clothes in it, catch some air in it, and then you had to build a raft and then you swim across in the Buffy Boo. It was my first exposure to cold water exposure. And we may touch on that later on. But then they thrashed the life out of us. And then they showed us that afternoon how to make a tactical basha, which is where you sleep if you're on the run. And basically you find the biggest, thorniest bush you can and you kick your way into it. And that's where we slept. In this Gore-Tex baby bag. Then we did a night navigation exercise. We were supposed to have dinner and they said, oh, sorry guys, there's been a problem. There's no dinner coming. So instead we'll do a night navigation exercise. And this went on and on. And basically over the 10 days, we walked, I reckon, somewhere between 250 and 300 kilometers.
Did anyone give up or did everyone kind of get through
There was a few people who quit. There's a few people who had to redo the course, which is getting to the end of it is pretty.
Was it the physical demand or was it the mental?
It's the mental, right? And it's so in those 10 days, the only food they gave us was a chicken between 4 people, and it was alive when we got it. And we were massively sleep deprived. It was so cold. It's in winter in the UK. You've no sleeping bag. You're so tired, and you fall asleep and then wake up shivering your ass off, right? And then the second 5 days, so the first 5 days, they thrash the life out of you physically. And then they teach you some skills, and then you have 5 days of escape and evasion where you're actually hunted by a hunter force. And then at the end of all of that, when we thought it was all over, we got introduced to the shock of capture, which is basically getting a bit of a kicking, getting bagged and tagged. And then we ended up going through interrogation. We had stress positions the entire time. It was probably about 12 hours. Stress positions are just horrendous. We were in a room, we were hooded, so you couldn't see. I thought it was in a room of my own. There was white noise, you know, that when the radio's off station, probably at the volume you'd hear music in a nightclub. And it puts you under enormous amounts of stress. And then we were dragged out every now and then and interrogated.
To see if you could stand up and respond if you were captured by an enemy or something.
Correct. And it's basically what the military terms stress inoculation training. And it's actually relevant to what we're going to speak about. But after that, and you know, the interrogators are professional interrogators and they're very, very good, right? And they bring everybody to their breaking point.
Stress inoculation.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you say that's relevant to what we're going to talk about, is that when we spoke and caught up, you mentioned that exercise and the stress of exercise can help you be more resilient outside of
Absolutely. And this was my first insight. So after that, it was maybe a week or so later, something happened to me that I would have normally found stressful. And it was just like water off a duck's back. And then another thing happened and I thought, whoa, this is interesting. And I started asking other people who I knew were on the course and they said the same thing. And that's when because I'd done a master's in exercise science, I knew that exercise is fundamentally good for us because it's a stressor, right? You put your body under stress, whether it's a cardiovascular stress of out running or biking or rowing, or it's a mechanical stress of lifting weights, which you clearly do a bit of, right? And it's the stress of exercise that initiates that tissue remodeling, right? So it's upregulation of stress response proteins that drive these changes at a biochemical level that make us ultimately bigger, faster, stronger, better.
So for the same level of stress, you're better able to tolerate that.
Absolutely. So, and people get it. You if you've been unfit, you go out for a run and you're just blowing out your ass, right? And you're really struggling. And then you do that run again and it's maybe a little easier, but you do it 5, 10 times, all of a sudden it's getting easier. Same with weights, resistance training, right? And this is one of the biggest problems that people have when they're designing their own exercise programs, is that they find something that they like and they do the same thing over and over again, right? One of the fundamental principles of exercise physiology is that of progressive overload. You need to progressively overload the system in order to stimulate adaptation, right? So it's the extra level of stress that drives adaptations. And for me, we became the dominant species on Earth, largely, not exclusively, but largely because we adapted better to stressors in our environment, right? And one of the best things that we did is that we traded off strength and power for dexterity, right? So if a gorilla was to hit me or you, they would hit us with 16 times the force that we could hit them.
Wouldn't take them on in an arm wrestle.
No, absolutely not. However, the next time you're at the zoo, and this is lost a little bit in the podcast, but you just go up to it and you do that, right? Where you are touching your fingers to your thumb, and you will mess with the gorilla's head because they don't have opposable thumbs, right? So we traded off all of that strength for dexterity in our fingers, which meant that we could manipulate things, right? With fine motor control in our fingers and the amount of nerve endings that we have there. And that made us able to make tools. So our ancestor 2.4 million years ago, Homo habilis, the tool maker, right? And that then enabled us to create weapons and do tools and to improve our environment or how we functioned in our environment. And then 1.8 million years ago, we stood up, Homo erectus. And that was actually fundamental to our development as a species. Because when you're in savanna grasslands, when you stand up, you can actually see over the grass. You can see predators, you can see prey. And the other thing that it does is that if you've ever done bear crawls, bear crawls as an exercise.
Yeah, they're tough.
They're really, really tough, right? Going around on 4 limbs is a lot more energy hungry than bipedalism. So walking on 2 legs actually uses a lot less energy and it frees up energy to create a bigger brain. What anthropologists think is sometime around then we created fire, and that helped us to unlock nutrients. Cooking meat, cooking vegetables, plants unlocks a lot of their nutrients, enables us to have more energy to develop to a brain. So there's this thing called the expensive tissue hypothesis. You look at every species and the size of their brain is limited by the amount of calories that they can actually spur for the brain, because it's the most hungry.
We have a lot of calories available today.
We
Does that mean our brains are going to get bigger?
Unfortunately not. I like your thinking, and if only that was the case. We are now overfed and undernourished, as you well know, right? But this whole thing about, and so we adapted better than any other species, but actually being able to move for long periods of time actually was a real benefit to our species, because we could hunt and gather, and we could, particularly if you're hunting prey, like if you're in the African savannah, if you look at the way that the Maasai or any of those tribes, they kill their food, an antelope, they'll just run it down. So the antelope can run much faster But if you run at a steady pace, it's got to look around, oh, they're still going, and they got to keep running, they keep running. Animals, the only way that they can cool down is by panting, right? And if you make them trot, they can't pant, they overheat, they fall over, and they walk up and they stick a spear in it, right? But it also gives the ability to hunt or gather far and wide, lots of plants and stuff like that. So anyway, and that and the fire unlocked those nutrients, helped us to have the bigger brain, made us smarter. And research that's just come out the other day showed that, and it was a very clever study, that Neanderthal, where they actually incubated those in the brain cells in a test tube dish, and it was pretty magic science by how they did it. But anyway, they showed that Neanderthal brains don't make as many neurons. So that's how we outcompeted the Neanderthals, was our smarts, right? That ability for us to develop this big brain was hugely important for our species, but we adapted to stress, right? And that is really, really key, is that there are a number of things. We're going to focus on exercise, but there's also things such as heat and cold stress that there are mechanisms, biological mechanisms that are conserved across species and across evolution that we benefit from exposure to heat and cold. And there's amazing stuff. I'm sure you've covered this on your podcast, that there are changes in gene expression whenever you become overly hot, like in a sauna, or you go into a cold water or an ice bath or even a cold shower, that upregulate protective genes. And it comes from these stress response proteins. They're the things that are the common link between exercise, heat exposure, cold exposure, and intermittent fasting that actually upregulate protective genes that improve your health, physical and mental.
Is another one of those kind of sort of micro stressors, some of the sort of plant defense compounds,
absolutely,
like certain polyphenols.
Yes. And here's the thing that a lot of people talk, and it does my head in when people talk antioxidants, right? There are things such as sulforaphane, I'm sure you're aware of, that's in broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, that whole family of cruciferous vegetables, right? Allicin in garlic, onions, leeks, chives, right? AGC and EGGC and other things that are in teas. And there are a whole list of what we call hermetic polyphenols or hermetic phytochemicals, right? So these are, a lot of people talk on resveratrol that you get in grapes and red wine. And I've heard people talk about their antioxidants. They're not antioxidants. Right. They're poison. They are small doses of poison. And as you're aware, they are very prominent in the leaves of the plant, and they are defense mechanisms against insects. So when an insect eats it, it actually triggers, and Mark Mattson showed this 10, 15 years ago, it actually triggers in the mouth, it realizes it's a toxin, signal to the brain, and there's an aversion response that says, don't eat it. But because we are much bigger, when we eat these plants, we actually just create a mild metabolic stress at a cellular level. That upregulates your, I like to simplify things, right? When people take antioxidant supplements, it's like your cells are being guarded by dad's army. When you eat those hermetic polyphenols or phytochemicals, you upregulate your own special forces soldiers, right? Superoxide dismutase, catalase, glutathione perioxidase. These are the special forces of your antioxidant defense system, right? And this is hormesis in action. Hormesis is described as sublethal exposure to stressors or toxins, which at high levels can kill us, at low to moderate levels induce stress resistance.
That's a really important point, right? Because, so for example, sulforaphane, I think it activates NRF2 pathway.
Yes, correct.
So then you get the production of glutathione, which is an antioxidant. So these compounds have the capacity to get your body to produce its own antioxidants.
Yes.
But there is some rhetoric out there that simply because these plants contain what we'd call defense compounds, that they shouldn't or they can't be part of an optimal diet at all.
It's complete and utter nonsense. And so a lot of the paleo, the carnivore guys, they talk about this. This is about the dose making a poison, right? So if you were to eat a ludicrous amount of this stuff in a concentrated form, then it could have a negative effect. But the amount of plants that we consume, they have hormetic effects, right? And so we know but this is the danger when you take a compound and you isolate it and you take it as a supplement, right?
Sure.
And you take high doses of it. Like we're seeing now that for a number of things, a number of drugs like rapamycin, which would appear to be pretty good in anti-aging, but too much actually accelerates aging, right? So there's a lot, and it's all explained by hormesis. Right?
It's an important point. Thresholds matter.
Absolutely. Thresholds for sure matter, right? You get too little sunlight, you will get vitamin D deficiency, and it increases your risk of huge amounts of chronic disease and destroys your brain. You get too much sunlight, you can get cancer, right? It is about the dose, right? You do too little exercise, shit house for you. You do too much, and we're talking ridiculous amounts that you can actually kill yourself, right? So it's sublethal exposure to intermittent stressors. That is the key.
So you're in the Navy.
Yes.
You finish up in the Navy and then you go and do your studies and become a professional boxer. So, how does this all happen?
So I did the Navy. I tried to box in the Navy and I wasn't allowed to because it was air crew, right? And in my last couple of years, I was doing helicopter search and rescue. Well, you sit around for a while, long time waiting for the buzzer, 24-hour duties. And you've got work to do, and then there's a lot of free time. I went and did a master's in nutrition because that's what I wanted my next career to be. So I moved over to Australia. I set up as a nutritionist and an exercise physiologist and started working one-on-one with high-end clients, and then realized, actually, it's behavior change. That's the key thing, right? So I went and did another postgrad in neuroscience. And then I'm like, oh, the mind is missing. I'm now doing my PhD in psychology, right? Just to round it all out. But I'd started initially doing a bit of white collar boxing and got bitten by the bug of white collar boxing, which is basically likes of me and you going and doing a charity do and that sort of stuff. But I got bitten by the bug. My wife was like, this stuff is really bad for your brain. And I said, yeah, no, I know. But so I negotiated with her, and I proposed that if she let me have one professional fight, that I would hang up my gloves forever. Right. Okay. So I did that. And I trained, but I trained for 5 months rather than 8 weeks. Because I knew as a physiologist, you can't just jump in as normal person out there and train like a professional boxer. You've got to progressively overload the system, which we will dig into in terms of boxing. So
it's a different kind of fitness too. So I've got quite a few friends. Actually, one of my good friends, he won the bronze medal in the Olympics.
Wow.
Recently.
Fantastic.
Harry Garside.
Harry Garside.
Yeah. Young
awesome.
fella. So one to watch. He's a young fella doing great things and an amazing speaker and just person. But I'd love to have him on the show at some time. I probably will. But watching him and also just doing some boxing myself through when I was playing football and then just recreationally, it's a different type of fitness. I'm not sure if you haven't done it, it's hard to appreciate just how fit these guys are.
Ridiculously fit, right? And little anecdote story. Richmond Tigers, some of them used to come and I did some work with their leadership team, and then some of them, when I lived in Melbourne in Paran, I had a gym and some of them used to come in and we had a boxing ring downstairs and we would get in and do a bit of sparring. And I remember they'd just done pre-season and I was sparring Dan Jackson, who's a midfielder, super fit, great guy.
I think he used to be, he was like the fittest in the league or was running the most kilometres per game at one stage.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, he was fit as a butcher's dog, but after a minute of sparring, he was spent. And he said, I can't believe this. And it's a different level of fitness. And then when you throw in other people punching you in the face, the adrenaline goes through the roof, right? And you're just so aroused. And you'll talk to people say, why the hell would you want to box, right? Particularly as a neuroscientist. And I know it's crazy, but you never feel as alive as you do when you get in that ring. And when the bell went for my professional fight, it is the one and only time I went into extreme fight or flight where I couldn't hear anything outside the ring. My focus went laser focus on this guy. It was like I was transported into a different world, right? And it's that extreme fight or flight. Like, you do not feel that alive normally. And that stuff can become addictive.
I want to circle back to kind of some of the training that maybe you did through that prep.
Yeah.
But so it was the wife that made you hang up the boots there?
Well, look, it was a bit of both. I mean, she said, and it's, you know, when somebody tells you something that you know in your heart that is right, and you go, oh, God, yeah, you're right. And so it's just not good getting punched in the head.
Yeah.
So I still do a bit of boxing training, but I don't spar.
So when you look at the kind of public health today,
yes,
as it stands, there's a lot of, I guess, attention on diet.
Yep.
We're not going so well there. There's a room for improvement.
Yep.
Particularly in I mean, across the entire world, there's issues, but within Western countries, there's a certain set of issues, and there's people talking about it. I'm not particularly sure at a population level how much progress is actually happening just yet. But
we're going backwards,
right? When you look at sort of our overall set of behaviors, lifestyle in general, nutrition gets a lot of focus. How do you sort of put in context exercise, and if you were to compare it to, say, nutrition in terms of its importance for the average person that does want to improve the health span, would like to maybe add extra years onto their life, are these two things, are you able to sort of quantify or compare the relative impact of each of these on our health?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and it's a very difficult question to quantify, but we have some data around it, right? So eating a reasonable diet will keep you in reasonably good health, right? And if you eat a very good diet, right, and whether that is vegetarian, vegan, or one that's meat with lots of plants in it, you know, the longevity benefits across those are relatively similar. We know that in this country, more than 50% of all foods eaten are ultra-processed food, right? And it's the ultra-processed foods that's really doing the damage, right? Forget about fat, carbohydrate, and protein. Stop eating shit that has not been alive, right? So my thing on nutrition, we'll just touch on it, is eat a low HI diet, where HI stands for human interference, right? So if you're a meat eater, the last time I looked, chicken don't give birth to nuggets and fish don't have fingers, right? If you're a vegan, soy burgers, you know, that's not good nutrition. Eating plants is good nutrition, right? Eating stuff that has recently been alive is the way that, and minimally interfered with by humans, is what you really want to do, because the research shows that there's a big study come out of France that people who have 4 serves or more of ultra-processed foods, which is really easy to do, have breakfast cereal and orange juice for breakfast, have a sandwich with bread for lunch, and then have a snack, a treat. There you're over 4. 62% increased risk of all-cause mortality versus people who don't eat any. Right, that's crazy. Like, you smoke 40 cigarettes a day, that does not increase your risk of all-cause mortality by 62%. Right. So, to go back to answer your question and the relevant importance of nutrition and exercise, if you're really bad at both, it will probably decrease your lifespan in equal amounts. Right. But if you're good at both, you get more bang for your buck from exercise, right? As above to eating a reasonable diet and being reasonably healthy or reasonable exercise, right? And there's a big study came out, published in JAMA in 2018, where they had over 220,000 people who had all done treadmill testing. And then they followed these guys up for more than a decade. And they looked at who died and when they died. And they also looked at their risk, or whether they had some comorbid diseases as well, right? So here's how it went. So the hazard ratio for death, right? Based on everything's compared to a 1. So I think if you had heart disease, current heart disease, you had a 1.41 or 1.42 hazard ratio of dying early versus somebody who didn't have heart disease. So a 40% increase. If you have diabetes, it's like a 40% increase, right? And some other diseases were a little bit less. If you were low fitness, low cardiovascular fitness, you had a 500% increased death rate versus those who were elite levels of fitness. And in every increased level of fitness, there was a step change in improved lifespan, right? And what the single biggest impact on your lifespan is having high cardiovascular fitness, cardiorespiratory fitness.
Which is measured by VO2?
By VO2 max, yeah.
Right. If someone hasn't heard of that before,
yes,
or maybe they have heard of it, but they've never had someone just simply define what does that mean?
Yeah. It is your maximal oxygen uptake, right? So it's the maximum amount of oxygen that you can take into your system and use and utilize, right? And another way of looking at it is METs, metabolic equivalent. So if we're just sitting around, it's 1 MET. We'll burn 1 calorie per kilogram, right, per minute. And then as you do more and more intense exercise or you get fitter, you have higher levels of METs. Right. So METs and VO2 are used interchangeably. But if people have a tracker like my Apple Watch, have you got a Whoop band?
I got a Whoop, yeah.
You got a Whoop, that probably will tell you your cardiovascular, it'll approximate your VO2. A Fitbit does it as well. I see we both have Oura rings on. They don't do it, right?
What do you think's better for measuring heart rate?
Oh, no, that's a really interesting
You need to wear
question.
a chest strap?
You need to wear a chest strap, right? Well, I'm a hurry.
Okay.
Right? So this Apple Watch, shit house when it comes to exercising heart rate.
Is it overestimating or underestimating?
It's massively underestimating my stuff. I think to get really good heart rate data, you need to have a heart rate monitor on. Now, that's just me, and it may be because I've got a hairy wrist.
That's interesting though. So when you're, and we'll probably circle back to the relevance of this, but if you're trying to work out what zone you're in or whatever.
Yes.
So if you're looking at your Apple Watch,
yes,
it's underestimating compared to a chest strap.
It's underestimating.
By how much? Like 10, 15%?
At least 10%. Yeah. Yeah. And I've kind of looked when I'm sitting in the sauna comparing the Apple Watch and the Oura Ring as well. And what I need to do is get my chest strap on, right? Yeah. And do it because the chest strap gives you the true.
Same thing happened to me. So I was doing, calculating my sort of zone 2 off of the Whoop.
Yes.
And I just felt like when I was in zone 2, I felt like I'm actually, I think my heart rate's higher here. I think I'm actually might be pushing out of zone 2 here.
Yeah.
And then I put the chest strap on and it definitely was. It was about 15 beats per minute higher on the chest strap.
Yeah. I think they're pretty good at resting heart rate, but when you get exercising heart rate, I wouldn't trust them. I don't trust it personally.
So that study there, essentially what it showed was that moving from lower fitness to higher fitness had a greater effect on mortality or premature death than did these comorbidities.
Than not having diabetes or not having heart disease, right? And it was amazing in that for every level of fitness that you go up, there was a very clear longevity benefit. And the beauty here, right? If there are people who are listening who are not currently exercising and know that their fitness is shithouse.
So they're in the low group.
They're in the low group, right? The biggest boon from your longevity goes from low to low average.
That's amazing.
And that's awesome. And then if you go from low average to above average, like that's massive. And going from low to above average, which is absolutely attainable for everybody who's listening, right? That has a dramatic impact on your longevity. And this, for me, is the beautiful message that we should be going. But it's a dose response. Right. So as you get, there was no upper limit to this, basically. The people who were elite, and that is in the top 2.5% of VO2, they actually had significantly lived longer, better lifespan than people who were high, above average. Right?
If people don't have a watch or a gadget that's measuring VO2,
Yes.
and say they're listening and thinking, well, firstly, I'd like to know kind of what's my baseline? Where am I at? So I guess, is there a sort of VO2 range that you would say, well, that's roughly low and that's high, or is that kind of irrelevant to the average person?
It depends on your age as well, right? And look, the best thing I think for people is a beep test. And there are tables, and we can put this all in the show notes for people, right? Where you can go and do a beep test. All you need is 20 meters. They even now have 15-meter ones, but you got to measure it out accurately.
Running back and forth between
Running
cones.
back and forward. And everybody, I know that there's all the listeners going, oh, I remember that from school. That's horrible.
Traumatic experience.
Yeah, that's right. But it's the last minute that's horrible, right? The last couple of minutes. Depends how much you push yourself. And you can push yourself psychologically, right? But that's a really good proxy for VO2. Now, my Apple Watch will tells me that now my VO2 max is 47, right? I know because I got it tested recently that it's about 51, right? Which is elite for my age.
That's pretty accurate then.
Yeah, it's not bad. It's within 10%, which is pretty damn good, right? And I always had a goal that was when I'm in my 50s, I want to have a VO2 max in my 50s.
And is there a chart that we can put in the notes that shows there's for your age?
Yeah,
this is
absolutely.
Where you should be.
So I've actually created for your listeners, I've created a chart of low average, all of that. And it came from this journal that I'm talking about. And we'll put in there all of those results. And the key thing, I think, is to get yourself cardiovascularly fit. Now, there's another beautiful study that came out quite recently that I read. In fact, I talked about it on my podcast last week, where basically they had this whole thing, right? So you clearly lift a lot of weights, and there's that whole thing. Is my cardio going to destroy my strength gains, right? This crossover effect, right?
We're all worried about that.
We are, yes. And so they did this beautiful study where they took a bunch of people and they trained them initially. They were unfit, really unfit. They trained them for 6 weeks in a progressive cardiovascular training program, right? And all the data shows 6 to 8 weeks of a progressive cardiovascular training program will significantly enhance your fitness, right? And what they found was that but actually they didn't train them completely. They trained one leg, right? And these are beautiful studies. These single leg studies are so awesome, right? Because if we're to do a study and you're in group A and I'm in group B, and there's say 100 of you and 100 of me, there's, are the results the diet that they put us on or the exercise regime, or is it your genetics, right? And you never know. So that's why you get one person.
The control is their other leg.
The control is their other leg. Like, this is the best type of stuff. And it's so clever. So they get this special bike where they just exercise one leg, right? So one leg gets really fit, the other leg doesn't. And they measured the capillary density.
What sort of intensity was that?
It was progressive. So they started them off zone 2 and then are adding in a little bit of zone 4, zone 5 stuff, right? And they measured the capillarization, so the amount of capillaries that are in there, and they got a big increase in the capillarization. But turns out that what that does is it triggers your satellite cells, your stem cells, to actually activate. And then when they went on a resistance training program, the leg that had been previously cardiovascular trained got more strength and more cross-sectional area as well. So it turns out that the base of cardiovascular training increased the capillarization and actually activated genes that would then improve their ability to gain strength.
So was that in that study did they do a phase of that cardio sort of respiratory fitness training and then strength training in a different block? Or because some of the questions are same day, like, yes, so sometimes people wonder, okay, in the same day, if I go and do my resistance training, is it problematic if after that I jump on and do 45 minutes of sort of moderate intensity steady state zone?
Yes. And look, the quick answer to that do your resistance training first.
Okay.
Right? That's the way that I always answer that question, and the research shows that.
Okay, so I want to make sure that we dig into how to improve your VO2 max from a sort of practical point of view. But before we get to that, so VO2 max is kind of one objective way of looking at our physical fitness.
Yes.
And you beautifully explained that study that shows how the magnitude of effect that it has on longevity and why we want to set up our exercise program in a way that will help improve it. What are the other things? So we hear people talk about like grip strength.
Yes.
What are the other kind of measures that are out there that we may want to consider that the research shows are associated with longevity or better health, and then may influence the type of exercise we're doing?
Yeah. So you rightly said grip strength, and look, grip strength is just a proxy.
Okay.
For your strength, right? A lot of people are like, oh, grip strength is really associated with longevity. And it is, right? People who have better grip strength live significantly longer, right? If there's one other thing that comes close to cardiorespiratory fitness, it's your grip strength, right? And another one is your ability to get off the floor using as minimal body surfaces as possible. Now, they are proxies. That one about getting off the floor is just about your overall mobility.
Mobility and stability.
Exactly. And we'll talk about mobility and stability, particularly as you get older. But the grip strength is basically a proxy for your overall strength and overall muscle
So when we
mass.
meet someone and we shake their hand,
yes,
we can get a good idea of
how long they're going to
their
live.
longevity.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. and so what we know about the importance of muscle overall, right? And this is really, really key. As you get older, we lose muscle mass at a rate of between 3 to 8% per decade, right? Which is quite a big swing, but it's huge. It is quite common that somebody who is the age of 75 will have lost half of all of their muscle mass. Like that's crazy. Now, I think we need to wind back a couple of layers here and look at this from a big picture and go back to our genome, right? And Professor Frank Booth said in 2012, the current human genome, he said the human genome has not changed in over 45,000 years. The current human genome requires and expects us to be highly physically active for normal functioning. Note the way he didn't say optimal. Now, leveraging off that, Frank Booth's lab showed that every time you exercise, there are activation of stress response genes, a subclass of which are called heat shock proteins, which we can get into.
That often comes up in the sauna conversation.
Absolutely. So the thing that connects the sauna and exercise and cold exposure are heat shock proteins, right? And people go, heat shock proteins in the cold? They were just called heat shock proteins because they were first noticed in heat, right? So they're stress response proteins. They then trigger the activation of a whole host of other metabolic priority genes. These are genes that just get upregulated and improve your metabolism in your body and your brain. Now, what we have discovered in the last 20 to 30 years, progressively more and more, are the role of myokines, right? So myokines are messenger molecules. So a cytokine, some people have heard of cytokines now because of COVID and the cytokine storm, right? So they're basically messenger molecules. So you have inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cytokines. Myokines are a subclass of these messenger molecules that are released in exercising muscle. We know that inside the muscle, they have autocrine and paracrine, which means that they act on the cell itself and they act on neighboring cells. But then they have endocrine effects, right? Like hormonal effects. They spill out of your muscle. Inside the muscle, they make your muscle bigger, faster, stronger. Outside of the muscle, they get into your bloodstream and they impact on your target organs, right? So what we now know about myokines is that they improve how your pancreas functions and produces insulin. They improve how your liver processes glucose, reducing a risk of diabetes. They improve your entire immune system and how that functions. There are certain myokines that kill tumors as well, that are protective against cancer. There are myokines that impact upon your gut microbiome, which then impacts upon all of your physical and mental health. There's myokines that actually increase your bone density, your capillary networks. And then in the brain, You have myokines, irisin that gets released in the brain, lactate that you get from people think about lactic acid.
Yeah.
That actually crosses the blood-brain barrier, this lactate, and triggers it and irisin in through two independent pathways, trigger the release of BDNF in the brain. BDNF, I'm not sure if your listeners have ever heard of it.
Yeah, it's come up on the episodes where we've spoken about brain health.
So BDNF is called brain-derived neurotropic factor. What does neurotropic mean? Nerve growth. We know that if you put BDNF on brain cells in the test tube, they grow like crazy, right? It's been called miracle growth of the brain.
Like fertilizer.
It's fertilizer. There are drug companies all around the world right now trying to synthesize BDNF and get it into a pill form where it can be taken and cross the blood-brain barrier. The first drug company to take a patent out of that, I will sell my businesses, I'll sell my house, and I will pawn my children, and I will buy shares in that company. Until that point, the best source of BDNF is exercise. And it's related to exercise intensity. It's around lactate threshold that BDNF spikes, right? And it's a really interesting study that with you put rats or mice in a water maze, and they hate water, right? So they really try very, very hard to get back. If you do prior running wheel, get them on a running wheel, and then you can take little parts of the brain and look at it, and you get higher BDNF, they do better on memory, right? And actually, I thought about this one day. This is one of my hypotheses, right? Why would BDNF be spiked so much around lactate threshold? And then I thought, well, when would you produce lactate back in evolutionary times? Hunting or running away.
Right.
So your brain makes real sense that your brain would actually release this stuff that goes, remember where this shit is.
Even foraging.
Foraging, absolutely. Hunting, gathering, right? When you find food, boom, remember where this is. So, or when prey, a lion jumps out to eat, remember where this is, right? So that for me makes sense. And it was corroborated by that rat study that showed that their spatial memory actually improved, right? So anyway, I digress. So these myokines are hugely important. And when we lose muscle mass, right, and as I said, 3 to 8% per year, and by the age of 75, most people have lost half of it. You've just lost a whole heap of medicine.
And the myokines, just to rewind one bit, they're actually being produced within the skeletal muscle?
Within the skeletal muscle.
Right.
And they escape outside of the muscle, right? So autocrine and paracrine is impact within the cell and within the next door neighbor cell.
And are they being produced mostly from resistance training or just any type of exercise?
Any type. It's just contracting muscle. Now, I haven't seen studies yet that are like, what's the optimal for the release? Because there's a whole heap. We now, there's over 600 myokines that have now been discovered. We only know what about 60 of them do. Like two of the most important are interleukin-6, which is an anti-inflammatory myokine, and BDNF, which some people say isn't a true myokine, but it is ultimately downstream of myokines. But there are a huge amount of myokines that do all sorts of different things. Now, Bente Peterson is a legendary exercise physiologist, and she released a study a few years ago that showed that exercise should be prescribed as therapy for 26 different chronic diseases. So her lab showed that exercise can either prevent and or treat 26 of the most common chronic diseases. Can you imagine if there was a pill that we could take that would simultaneously reduce our risk of 26 chronic diseases? It would be the best-selling product that human beings have ever produced. But it's free, and it's exercise, right? And so...
But it requires behavior change.
It requires behavior, and it's difficult, right? And that's the thing. So this brings to the question, how much should we do? Right? How much exercise should we be doing? Right? How many steps should we take? Right? And, we talk about steps and the 10,000 steps a day. And, I had a Fitbit for years, and then I've got an Apple Watch now, and was always measuring my steps. And one day I thought, where does this come from? This 10,000 steps. So I dug in to the literature around it. You know where it comes from?
Japan or something?
Japanese marketing campaign for a pedometer company when the Japanese Olympics were on, right? Bugger all science behind it whatsoever. It just looked at 10,000, looked like the symbol for the Olympics. And it's like, oh yeah, that's a number. Now, so people have got, and actually there was a big study, the biggest global study of physical activity used smartphone data, and they tracked people in 111 countries. And what they found, it was a wide range of steps. But on average, the lowest was Indonesia, 3,500 steps a day. And if you've ever been in Indonesia, you talked about Bali and the traffic. You've ever been to Indonesia? It's crazy, the traffic.
I think that might have been in our take one.
Yeah.
Take one? I'm not sure we made it clear. We started recording and we had a little hiccup.
We did.
But yeah, when I go to Bali, long story short, anyone who's been there knows the roads are chaotic. Yes. They're not exactly the roads that you're going for a nice leisurely stroll on. So my steps in Bondi is usually about 15,000. Walk from home to studio to the gym. But in Bali, you tend not to walk that much unless you're on the beach.
Absolutely.
And probably average about 3,000.
Because you take your life in your hands,
that's
right? And so 3,500. And the highest was Hong Kong and China, 7,000. Australia, about 5,000 steps a day, right? So, and that's on average in a population, right?
Really illustrates how important your environment is, though.
Oh, mate, we could talk for hours about the built environment, and actually, me and my wife had this discussion, and particularly when we get to retirement, we are going to make sure that we are in somewhere where the built environment is around for physical activity. And so at government level, they do lots of stuff around planning for the built environment and having walkable cities and stuff like that, because it shows that just, if you move your step count from 5,000 to 8,000, you get huge benefits. But it's not the be all and end all of everything. And this is why the recommendations for physical activity don't include step counts, right? Because it's about, you could walk 15,000 steps, but walk really slowly. And that's nowhere near as good for you as if you're running or doing higher intensity or lifting weights or those sorts of things, right?
I think this is a really important point, because I often have this conversation with, folks I know who are maybe aged in their 50s or 60s, and they say exactly that. They say, well, I do my 10,000 steps a day, and I'm not sure they fully understand the benefit of having some very specific types of training over and above sort of leisurely walking.
Yeah, look, leisurely walking and walking in general will get you quite far, right? But if you want to enhance your longevity, and especially if you want to enhance your health span. So I'm more interested in health span than lifespan. What's the point of living to 100 if the last 25 years are in wheelchair and on multiple medications and stuff like that, and demented, right? I'm about increasing the amount of healthy years, disease-free years. I'm sure you've talked about this on the podcast, right? So walking will get you a reasonable amount, but in order to really improve your health span, you need moderate to vigorous physical activity, MVPA, right? And that's what the recommendations are. So in this country, in the United States and the UK, they're all pretty much identical, right? It's 150 to 300 minutes of moderate physical activity a day, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous.
A week.
Sorry, did I say a day? A week.
A day, yeah.
Thank you.
Just to not scare everyone.
Yeah, exactly. A week, right? And making sure that there's at least 2 strength training sessions, right? And we can tweak those things, right? So most Australians don't hit the bottom limit. And most people in most advanced economies don't hit the bottom limit. For me, this question was answered beautifully by a study by Harvard researchers where they studied the Hadza. These are one of the last true hunter-gatherer tribes on Earth. There are others that live in the Amazon, but these guys are more accessible. So 90% of their food intake is still from hunting and gathering, right? So they live a life that is as close to the one that is optimized for us from a genome perspective, right? And so what these guys did, it was a beautiful study. For 2 weeks, they put heart rate monitors on them and physical activity trackers because they wanted to know not just how much they moved, but what was the intensity, right? And they did it for 4 2-week periods in the year, spread out the year because they wanted to catch the dry season and the wet season as well. So get a real good snapshot all year round. And they did half males, roughly half males, half females from the age of, I think it was 15 to 60 or 65. So they got a really big spread. Turns out that heads of women do almost 14,000 steps a day. Heads of men, 18,500 steps a day, right? But that wasn't the whole bit of the story because they measured moderate to vigorous physical activity. And it turns out that the Hadza do 135 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a day, 945 a week. Yet we can't do 150 of moderate. So this was moderate to vigorous. This was a mix of them. And so and if we go back to Professor Frank Booth's talk, the current human genome requires and expects us to be highly physically active for normal functioning.
Can I ask you a question? Something I always think about with regards to kind of our genome and evolution, right? So clearly humans have a set of behaviors, and if you look at back ancestrally, there's a set of behaviors. How much of the sort of behaviors that we come to learn about our ancestors are relevant, I guess, when we're thinking about health span versus when I think about evolution, I think mostly about sort of getting to an age to procreate, being the major goal of evolution, as opposed to the conversation you and I are having is about improving health span, which it could be that, certain behaviors that get you to an age to procreate could be disadvantageous for long-term health.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a thing called antagonistic pleiotropy that sort of describes that phenomenon. But so I'm wondering sort of how much can we take away by just looking at our ancestors and what they did, given our goals are slightly different?
Yes. And look, it is a very good point, but I think when we're talking about exercise and diet, we can see, and for me, it's about how we've co-evolved with our environment, right? So we co-evolved with plants, and we co-evolved eating these plants and eating some animal food. But the polyphenols, the phytochemicals that we talked about, that we get mostly from plants, we also get some stuff from animal foods. These things are cofactors and enzymes for lots of our chemical reactions, right? That happen. So I like to take stuff down into the biology, right? And particularly around that biochemistry that's happening, the epigenetics, the switching on and off of genes, and how lots of those phytochemicals are really important in those biological reactions, right? So they actually help our ecosystem of cells to actually run effectively. They are the things that I think that we can actually take and go, okay, so that's important fundamentally for our biology. And we can see that a lot of those things are activating longevity pathways. We can see that the exercise is activating longevity pathways, right? And so those sorts of behaviors, I think we can draw inferences from those behaviors around our health span and our lifespan, right? That would be my way of answering that question. And the genome's really interesting. I used to work with a molecular geneticist called Margie, and she said something brilliant to me one day. She said, Paul, what most people don't realize is that you sign a pact with your genes, right? And basically your genes say, okay, I'll keep you alive and healthy. But we forget to read the small print. And the small print says, until you've passed optimal childbearing age, and then all bets are off, right? And if you're sitting listening to this and you're in your 40s or your 50s or your 60s, you know what I'm talking about, because it just becomes harder. Because your genes don't give a stuff about you. Your genes actually only care about the species, right? And about procreation, right? So they'll keep you alive and healthy until you've passed optimal childbearing age. And then it goes to rat shit, menopause, andropause, and it all goes downhill. And that's when we have to work harder, right? This whole thing, you know, we don't stop exercising because we grow old. We grow old because we stop exercising.
So how do we piece all this together, right?
Yeah.
So there's evidence that looks at VO2 max. You spoke about grip strength.
Yes.
Sometimes people also within this conversation talk about, and this might come into sort of how you apply this, but people talk about sort of metabolic flexibility and being a good fat burner. And I think a lot of that talk sort of certainly I think has been brought to light through the endurance community who have sort of been championing this idea of zone 2 or sort of moderate intensity, steady state exercise. And you hear people talking about lactate thresholds and all of that sort of stuff. Is your ability to kind of sit in that steady state in your aerobic base, is that another thing that's as important as, say, VO2 max and strength to look at?
Yeah, I think it's a fundamental building block for this stuff. I think it is important. I mean, a lot of my training, and it's interesting, right? Because when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And because I'm ex-military and did some boxing, you know, I was all into the high intensity stuff, high hit training and stuff like that. And as I've started looking more into the literature, I've actually realized, you know what, I need to get to also do a base of that zone 2, as you refer to, that baseline cardiovascular training, because it does different things in the muscle, right? It helps with that muscle capillarization, and it gives you a really good base for your muscles to function well off, right? And then we need to add in the higher stuff as well. So my recommendations are always for people, if you've got limited time to exercise in a week, right? Make sure you do at least one of those steady state, right? 30 minutes plus, right? And if you don't have heart rate monitor, the big thing is, can you carry on a conversation, right? Let's just make it really practical for people. You need to know that, yes, you're moving, but you should be able to carry on a conversation, right?
And so how long's that session?
And that session is depending on your fitness and depending on your goals and depending on how much time you have. At least 20 minutes, right? At least 20 minutes of just getting out and doing steady state stuff. Ideally, it's 30 plus, right? And if you're now, here are where some of these recommendations are about health span. They're not about performance, right? If you're about performance, different podcast.
Sure. You're going to sit in zone 2 a lot more if you're an endurance cyclist or something.
Absolutely, right? And actually, MAF training, you familiar with Phil Maffetone and MAF training and actually nudging it down to that lower end of zone 2. And I read it and I'm like, oh, really? And then a good mate of mine who is a ninja, Professor Grant Schofield, who's a triathlete and who trains triathletes and works with special forces, he goes, mate, this shit's real.
So what's the kind of rationale for that?
The rationale for that is just about your aerobic base. And it's very similar to zone 2, but for some people, the upper end of zone 2 is getting out of that zone.
It's pushing lactate up a bit
pushing,
too high.
you don't want lactate. You want to be really in that sort of lower end of zone 2.
It's interesting though, so because that's where lactate gets, or lactic acid gets a bad rap, right? Because it'll push you out of zone 2.
Yes.
But to your point earlier, lactate, which has often been sort of considered as a toxic byproduct, from what I'm hearing from you and I've seen elsewhere, it actually can have important effects on our immune function.
It's wonderful stuff, right? It is wonderful stuff. And this is this whole thing about confirmation bias, right? It is very, very strong. And when you're a hammer, it looks like a nail. And so when you take a step back and you look at different bits of research, you see, it's really complicated. I mean, exercise is complicated. Nutrition is ridiculously complicated, but at least in exercise, we can do those single leg studies. Imagine that we could do where you could split your body in half and one half gets one diet and the other half gets it. Like that, that's where you get some true evidence.
That'd be incredible. Right? Half vegan, half carnivore.
That's right. That's right. And let's roll it out and see which half of the body dies first.
Right.
But until we get to that point, we have to make do. Now, so exercise you can do better studies, and we can, we can take a muscle biopsy, right? Which is, and I've done a muscle biopsy before. It's horrible. You stick this massive needle in, you pull out this piece of about the size of a rice bubble, and then you can stick it under the microscope and look at the changes in enzyme activity and muscle synthesis and all sorts of stuff. So we do know a lot more about exercise. So anyway, let's get back to this.
So one steady state, at least 20 minutes, potentially 30 minutes.
Potentially 30 minutes. And if you got more time, maybe a little bit more.
And you're puffed, but you can still have a conversation.
Correct. Yeah. You're working, but you can still have a conversation. And then for me, it's just skip right past zone 3, get right up to zone 4 and 5, right? Where you're going hard. And probably the two most effective ways of increasing your VO2 max quickly are doing intervals, right? And so a 4-minute interval where you go as hard as you can for 4 minutes. And at the end of the 4 minutes, you should be goosed, right? Whether that's a run, a bike, a row, it doesn't matter what that is.
Your heart rate's kind of...
And your heart rate is getting right up towards its max, right, at the end of it. So, and again, this depends on your level of fitness.
Yeah, what if someone kind of just struggles to hold that for 4 minutes?
Well, you will get... Look, so for them... there's another thing that they can do, which we'll get into in a second. But to finish this off, you go for 4 minutes and you're going hard, right? And if you struggle, that last minute is where you push, right? But ideally, you're going at a reasonably steady pace throughout, but you're going hard. And at the end of 4 minutes, you're toast. And then you recover for, again, depending on your fitness, 1 to 2 minutes only. And you do that 4 times, right? So there's 4 blocks of 4 minutes. That's 16 minutes with either 3 or 6 minutes recovery.
It's going to take you about half an hour total.
It's under half an hour, right? And so I'm all about bang for your buck, right? The other way of doing it then is high intensity interval training, right? And again, there's a bit of misnomer around this. Like most people who do HIIT, you go do a gym class of HIIT. It's not really HIIT, it's HISS, right? So if you think about your heart rate profile, and this was my good friend Michel Dalcour, who is a brilliant exercise scientist. Like if you're going and you're doing a CrossFit class or an F45 or something like that, and you look at your heart rate, it is high throughout the class. Like you get a little dip when you recover in between the sets, but you're high all the way through. It's high intensity, almost steady state. The classic high intensity interval training stuff, all the stuff that was done early in the labs, where you go all out for between 30 seconds and a minute, and then you recover for 4 to 5 minutes.
So how important is the up and then the recovery period in terms of getting the adaptations?
Yeah, so look, and again, we haven't compared, or I haven't seen data, maybe somebody else has, about the classic HIIT. Right. Go all out for a minute, recover for 4 and repeat, because that takes quite a while if you're doing 5 sets of that. The way that I prefer to do it, because I'm time poor, is that I will go, and I have a Versa climber, and it's an evil piece of equipment. Are you familiar with the Versa climber? It's like a stair climber, but with handles. So your arms are above your head, and it's horrible. They used to have them on ships because they're great they're great on ships because it doesn't matter if you wobble, right? But the Versa climber is an evil piece. So I will go 30 seconds hard, and then I'll recover for 30 seconds, and I'll do 10 of those. So I'm doing 10 30-second intervals. Now, if you're not as fit, you might go hard for 30 seconds and then recover. And if you're really unfit, let's say there's a listener here, Mr. and Mrs. Nurkenfurken. They're in their 50s, they've done bugger all, and they're sitting listening to this going, I need to start exercising. Lampposts. Lampposts are your friend. What I want you to do is go out every night after dinner, or whenever, and between the first 2 lampposts, you're going to walk at a reasonable pace. Between the next 2 lampposts, you're going to walk really fast. Then you're going to walk slow. Then you're going to walk fast, right? And you do that for 10 to 15 minutes. By the end of that, they're going to be really blowing, right? After a week of doing that, it's going to start to get reasonably easy. After they've done that 3 or 4 weeks, they're going to come back to me and go, Paul, that's easy now. I'm like, awesome. And the beauty of this is, if you're really unfit, your window of adaptation is huge.
So going back to what you said earlier, that low
to low average, amazing impact on your health. Most improvement. It's just huge. And this, I think, needs to be the message that people need to hear. If you're doing nothing, this is friggin' awesome, because anything you do is going to have a remarkable impact upon your health, right? And so if you take someone like you who clearly goes to the gym a lot, for you to actually improve your strength, it's going to take a shitload of work versus somebody who comes in and hasn't done anything. They can do almost anything. Like, you can design them a shit resistance training program and they will get strong quickly, right? So that window of adaptation is really, really important, right? So then as they get fitter, I'm going to go, okay, for the next month, I want you, between the first 2 lampposts, you're going to do the Nurken shuffle, right? So you're going to do a slow shuffle. You're going to try to run, and then you walk, and then you run, and then you walk. And the same thing, right? They're going to adapt quickly. Then it's, okay, now I want you to jog, right? And then as they get fitter, okay, you're going to go pretty hard. And as they get really fit, so if I'm training you, I'm like, mate, lamppost, first 2, sprint, then walk, then sprint, then walk. That's high intensity interval training.
And if someone has kind of joint or like knee issues, are they doing a different type of exercise?
You can always do it. Go and see an exercise physiologist, right? So, and the way I say it, so I used to have a registered training organization that trained personal trainers. And you know, I've trained thousands of personal trainers over the years and done lots of stuff. And there's brilliant personal trainers out there. But it's generally a 12-week to 6-month course. An exercise physiologist is doing 4 years, right? They are a specialist. It's like nurses versus doctors. And a lot of those guys will be specialists in certain areas. So if you have an issue, they will design a program for you, right? One of the best things you can do if you got an injury is swimming, right? Or getting one of those water belts that you put on and you try to run in a swimming pool. Like, that is hard yakka. That's really hard. You can cycle. I mean, as you get older, cycling becomes really, really good, right? And even those indoor stuff, really good, because you don't have to leave the house, right? So there's always ways that you can adapt.
And what's the frequency? So you said with the steady state, it was try and do 1 a week.
Yeah, and with this stuff, it's at least 1 a week, and I would be leveraging towards 2 of those a week, right? And again, it all depends how many you had, but if people just had, say, 4, they can do 4 half hours a week, right? Let's just say, which should be your bare minimum, right? So you're doing, 120, you haven't even hit. Actually, let's go for the bottom rung, 150 minutes. So you're doing 5 30-minute sessions. I actually think you're better doing a 20-minute session every day, but that's another conversation. So let's say we got 5. Personally, I would be doing 1 steady state. I would be doing I'd be probably doing 2 of the high intensity stuff. Maybe if you're just starting out, you'd do 2 steady state and 1 of the high intensity. And then I'd be doing 2 strength training sessions. And probably if you're starting out, I'd be doing full body circuit training, right? Just do your whole body in a circuit, exercising all of your muscles. Particularly if you're starting out, you'll get really good gains there, right?
Before we move to strength,
yes,
and clearly we're going to have to keep this as an open conversation. I'd love to get you back on so we can dive deep. I'm conscious that you got a flight to get to, but on high intensity interval training, a question that I often see that comes up is from women online who maybe they've had an experience themselves, or they've come across information online and they're wondering if high intensity interval training is, say, safe for women of childbearing age or transitioning through menopause. Do you have any thoughts in terms of differences with programming for men versus women if we're considering sort of high intensity training? Yeah,
look for me, I think that's really small nuance, right? I think if we're talking general, I don't see a reason for having significant amounts of difference for that. Now, having said that, particularly when you come around menopause, there becomes certain other influences, that things that you need to think about, right? But I think what's even more important for the message to get to women is they need to do strength training as well, right? And this whole, and I've heard many women talk, I'm sure you have, I don't want to lift weights because I don't want to get
There's
big
some
muscles.
fear.
Jesus Christ, do you know how hard it is to put on muscle?
Yeah.
even when you have lots of testosterone.
I think we have the bodybuilding industry to thank for that, right?
Yeah.
There's this kind of association. If you lift weights, you're going to look like that.
Yeah, and it's not true, right? I mean, to have your level of muscle is a lot of work, right? And also you're limited by body shape and body type, right? So there's some certain people, they just need to look at weights and they put on a lot of muscle, right? Think Polynesian guys, right? And there are other people that it's a lot harder for them to put on muscle. So it is quite hard to put on significant amounts of muscle. But the key thing is that we want to be going into older age with a reserve of muscle, right? Because we will lose it despite our best efforts. And this is so important for people to understand, is that if you are 65 years old, the 7th biggest killer is falls, where people fall over and they break a pelvis or they break a hip, and about half of them are dead within 5 years, right? When you get to 75, it's the 5th biggest killer. And it comes because of two things. Number one, we lose our fast twitch muscle fibers and we lose bone mineral density, right? And they're linked. Walking doesn't do anything for bone mineral density. You need mechanical force. Running does. Lifting weights is awesome for bone mineral density and preserving that bone mass. But it's your fast twitch fibers. And this is when I used to train personal trainers. I'd say the most important thing for older adults is power training, right? And people don't understand when I say that word, Power, power. It's like I'm playing golf, but power training. And people go, whoa, hold on a minute, power, that's for athletes. If you think about it, power equals work done divided by time, which is force times distance divided by time. So you either have a really high force or you move it quickly. So if you're walking down the street and you trip, the ability for you to quickly regain your foothold or to put your hand out and stop yourself from falling requires fast twitch muscle fibers, right? They're the ones that we lose first. So that is why, particularly as you get into your 40s, it is really important that you're doing power training. And then, particularly as you get into your 50s, we need to be doing balance training and agility training. So the mix is then going to shift a little bit. And actually, a lot of people are surprised when I say this. After you hit 50, you need to do more exercise, not less. Because your genes have given up. They don't care. And you've actually got to work harder.
3 to 8%.
3 to 8% per decade.
From the age of...
From your mid-20s.
Right, from the mid-20s.
From peak muscle
So this
mass.
kind of speaks to the importance of starting resistance training early.
Absolutely.
And trying to have a good amount of muscle mass going into those.
And you know what? There's a real misnomer. My 12-year-old is doing resistance training. My 12-year-old boy.
Yeah, I guess people think about stunting, right?
Yeah. And it's a complete misnomer. Now, there's certain exercises that you should be doing or should not be doing, loading lots of weight. But really, when I'm training with Oscar, it's more about his neuromuscular system, right? It is about those nerve pathways into the muscle and that becoming more efficient. And then when he then starts to go through his strength phase, which is around 14, 15, depending on when they hit puberty, then he's going to be really primed for putting on muscle and developing power and all of those sorts of things, right? So I think definitely starting early is really key.
And so coming back to that question about women and HIIT training, it sounds like what you're saying is there's no reason to fear HIIT training, but rather than, smashing yourself doing that every single day, think about having some resistance training in there. And I think one thing that I definitely have experience with working with women is often doing a lot of HIIT training.
Yeah.
and being highly stressed in their life as well and underfueled.
Yes,
and the recovery's terrible and they're feeling very depleted.
So I actually, if we think about that, right, and if we think about, particularly if I've got a lot of stress in my life, right, and on top of that, you might be working, having kids. You're doing, on average, more housework than men, right? And that's the case in my house, and I'm guilty of that. But so and women generally, particularly if they're mothers, tend to be givers, right? They tend to give, and they don't have time for self-time. And then they're going, oh, I don't have time for exercise, so I'm just going to go and do HIIT because I want to get the best bang from my buck. And then if you're not recovering and you're not fueling properly, right, and then it comes to menopause, there's changes in hormones that make you put on weight. So you're further tweaking down your food and trying to up your exercise. You can just run yourself into the ground, right? So from that context, if you've got all of those different stressors, is make sure, yes, do maybe one session of HIIT training, and then the other ones dial it back a little bit, right? Do some strength training that isn't as intense, right? It used to be that every workout that I did was super intense. Now I've just learnt the value, and it's only taken me 15 years. I used to work with a guy called Ian O'Dwyer, who is a brilliant guy in terms of his ability to get people to move really well, right? I've seen a number of people who were told by their orthopedic surgeon they needed to have joint replacements. They go and see OD and got better really, really quickly. His stuff was just all about moving the fascia as well as the muscle, right? So particularly as you get older and we're sitting lots, that just movement training, yoga and other forms, functional flexibility becomes really, really important, because if you're not doing that stuff and we're sitting lots and we're stressed, our muscles tighten up. We get all sorts of trigger points through those muscles. We get injuries. Then we can't move, right? And then if you can't move, we're laying down more fascia, connective tissue, and it gets really stuck up. Then you get all hunched over and you move less and less. So particularly, you got to start to then become quite smart and make sure that you're doing those mobility, whether it is a functional movement class or you're doing yoga. Like some forms of yoga are great. And you see how many professional athletes enhance the longevity of their careers from doing that sort of stuff.
So when you think about sort of exercise overall, you're thinking about cardiorespiratory fitness,
yes,
which ties into the VO2 max. You're thinking about, I guess, aerobic base a little bit with the steady state stuff, resistance training,
yes,
and then this stability, mobility piece.
Stability, mobility piece, particularly as you come older. And that really plays into the quality of life stuff, right? There's a lot of people, I'll have seen them, you'll have seen them, gym rats who lift a shitload of weight, and by the time they get in their 50s and 60s, they cannot move, right? They cannot move. Or you see a lot of footy players and stuff like that have got busted knees and shoulders, and that just becomes really important. So I've actually modified my training now that I'm in my 50s, where I'm building in more of that mobility, flexibility training. And I like to talk to people about movement snacks. And this is one of the great gifts of the pandemic, is that a lot of people are working from home, right? And I say to people, a really important thing that is stop thinking about, I need to go to the gym to do exercise. Right beside my desk, I've got a kettlebell and club bells, right? And on a regular basis, I will get off my arse and I'll do 30 seconds of kettlebell swings and some club bells. And what I'm doing by doing that is I'm getting up, I'm correcting my posture, I'm getting blood flow and oxygen to my brain. I'm burning up stress hormones, right? Stress hormones are there to make you fight or flight, fight or run away. It's when we sit all day long with the stress of work that then it switches over into cortisol production, right? So a really important thing in this message is to have lots of movement snacks throughout the day, where you just get off your arse and you move, right? Do 30 seconds to a minute of high intensity exercise, and then just, stretch, move around, just get your body mobile and stuff like that. and then drink some water, do a minute of box breathing or resonant frequency breathing, and then get back to work. That's like taking your brain and your body and plugging it into the wall to get a recharge. And I think not enough people think about this. They think I have to go to the gym in order to do exercise. You can accumulate a huge amount if you just have those regular little movement snacks.
Love it. So movement snacks, you got your steady state once a week.
Yep.
Trying to get one or two of those HIIT workouts in, a couple of resistance training sessions.
Yep.
And then on top of that, focusing on some mobility and stability. It sounds like a lot, but I think once you put that down onto paper, it's not that much.
It's not that much. And I think what we've just talked about, that's about 150 minutes. That's about 2.5 hours a week.
The neuroscience piece is interesting though, right? And behavior change. And,
yes.
And I think that probably get you back on. Let's go through that.
Mate. We could talk about that for days.
Because our ancestors, they didn't have to sort of sit down and necessarily make this decision about exercising. Movement was a requirement for survival.
Absolutely. And this is the thing that I said in my book that's just about to be released, Death by Comfort. If you have a job that requires you to move and be on your feet, I think that's worth tens of thousands of dollars a year extra versus a job where you're sitting all day long.
Right. Yeah, we've created these conveniences that are killing us.
Absolutely. And that prolonged sitting, I mean, we talked a lot about exercise. One of the most important things that you can is minimize your sitting, right? Just get the money, stay off the piss for 2 or 3 nights and buy yourself a sit-to-stand workstation, right? So that you can reduce the amount of hours that you are sitting. And because we know that sitting is the new smoking, and that's not an over-dramatization, right? The inactivity physiology, like when you sit for 30 minutes or more at a time, right? We're both sitting right now, and there are massive changes in gene expression that are going on that affect our health in really negative ways. So one of the most important things that people can do is just break up your sitting. Just get off your arse, ideally every half an hour, and just activate your metabolism.
Some great knowledge. Thank you, Paul. This has been incredible. I wish we had more time to continue this, but I know that you got to jump on a flight, more sitting. So maybe you can do some star jumps after this.
Absolutely.
But there's clearly a lot more that we can delve into. So I mean it, that let's make this an open conversation. Come back and join me again, round 2, and see where we go.
Mate, I'd absolutely love to. Hopefully there are some good takeouts that people can have. And I think just to preempt the conversation around behavior change, I think it's stop thinking about exercise as what you look like. You need to think about exercise as a fundamental to your biology. And also is think about how you feel after you've exercised compared to days when you don't exercise, right? That's the way that we need to start thinking about this stuff.
Beautifully put. If folks would like to find you online, or you mentioned your podcast earlier, if they want to check that out, where should we send them? We'll put all this in the show notes along with any of the studies that you've mentioned. Yeah,
so my podcast is called the Mind, Body, Brain Project podcast. My website, mindbodybrain.com.au, Instagram at mindbodybrainpi for Performance Institute. And my book is coming out. It's on pre-order now. It's called Death by Comfort, Why Modern Life is Killing Us and What We Need to Do About It.
Amazing. Look forward to reading it. Thanks,
awesome.
Paul.
Thanks, mate.
Cheers. Thank you for joining me for this episode and your interest in science-based conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and found the information covered interesting and instructive. If you did and you'd like to show your support for the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can stay up to date with new episodes and watch them in video format. Yes, the full-length videos. Please also consider subscribing to the show on the Spotify and/or Apple Podcast app, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. You can also leave a review on Apple or Spotify. Again, a great way to support the show and make our content more discoverable for others to enjoy and learn from. If you have any comments about the episodes, suggestions for future episodes, including guests you'd like to see on the show, or questions that you'd like to have answered, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. I myself and my team will take note of these comments when planning future episodes. Finally, the best way to support the show and receive discounts on products we love is by checking out our sponsors at theproof.com/friends. Enjoy your week, stay well, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.